At The Nocturnist, we are careful to ensure that all stories comply with healthcare privacy laws. Details may have been changed to ensure patient confidentiality. All views expressed are those of the person speaking and not their employer.
Every spring, Match Day rolls around. It's the day where medical students open up their envelopes and learn where they're going to be doing their residencies. Sometimes there are tears of joy. Sometimes there are tears of sorrow. But what about the medical student who doesn't match at all? I'm Emily Silverman, and this is The Nocturnist, stories from the world of medicine. In this episode, physician Maureen Miller describes how after Match Day, her life took an unexpected turn, and how an old, dusty box of autopsy records helped her to embrace her new future. After the story, Maureen and I talk about creativity and humor in medicine and dig deeper into the evolution of her professional identity. Here is the incredibly talented Maureen Miller.
Basically, during medical school, I used to do these, not really like readings, but almost like performance art things that were kind of like, they were about medical narratives and about being a doctor, but they were done in character as like a different doctor. So here we're gonna try to pull a little bit of a Star is Born move here, like the vampire makeup. So I'm going to be the real me. I'm not going to be in the character of me as a doctor. And for those who are new, there'll probably be a lot of exciting experiences out of it. So anyway, as one would expect from that intro, I'm a pathologist. So let me just take you guys back. This is 2 weeks before Christmas 2016. And my boss was gonna kill me, except, like, of course he's a pathologist. He could tell you exactly how he's gonna kill you and the method by which he did it. He may have stepped out, actually. I saw him here earlier, but his name's Dr. Melamed. I'll let you guess who he is. So Dr. Melamed in Christmas 2016 is working with me on a paper that is not exactly the most exciting topic to even the most devoted of surgical pathologists. It's about tumor of the parathyroids. So this parathyroid tumor had been the result of like a previous parathyroid growth, and we just wanted to explain how it looked for an academic publication with an endocrinologist. And whatever we were produced was not exactly lighting Dr. Melamed's fire, who is somebody who could probably sit for 20 hours a day at a microscope and never get tired at all, but he was just tired that Saturday afternoon for whatever reason. And in a couple of recent encounters with him, he had said to me, again, like quoting Ecclesiastes, he goes like, "Maureen, there is nothing new under the sun." I thought it was, at the time, I was horrified, but I thought it was just like this incredibly profound and beautiful statement. And this particular day had that vibe, and he says, he gets this like gleam in his eye almost, as if he's actually giving me a holiday present. And then he's a very tall man with a long torso, and like he tends to like lead conversations with his torso. Then he says like, "Maureen, this is my present to you for the holidays. The lab manager, Gerald, found it, and he wants you to write a novel out of the books that are in this box." And I look at him like, I was trying to like resist my language, like, are you kidding me? The endocrinologist who's there with us, who doesn't even like know Dr. Melamed, is like, I'm out. I'm done. And then he says like, "No, but like, you're so passionate about history and about like racial disparities and ethnic disparities in medicine. This is the entire autopsy records of Bellevue from 1897. And I think that you're the only person in this department who will know what to do with them. Like somebody dropped them off in the ER and we just have been trying to figure out what to do with them for years." So I give him, of course, like the very enthusiastic resident response of thanks but no thanks, like trying to be polite about like, "I'm not doing this, not on your life." But then he nudges me about it every time I see him for about a year and a half after that. And finally, it gets to the point where I'm about to graduate from residency, and I had accepted a job in another city, and I think, like, this is the hospital where I went to medical school and residency. Like, I may never see these books again. So I, as is probably not so evident from the story, came into medicine as an inner city school teacher interested in kids with lead poisoning and, like, air pollution-related disorders. And so for the entirety of medical school, I was convinced that I was going to be a pediatrician. I chose NYU over other medical schools because I felt like a specific interest in becoming devoted to a Bellevue-based practice dealing with problems of chemical exposures in children and maybe occupational exposures in adults as well along the lines. So I gear most of my medical training toward that for the 4 years of medical school. And then on St. Patrick's Day, they have what's known as the match, the algorithm that determines whether and when you're going to get a position for the next year for your internship, where you could potentially be for the not only just 1 year, but like 5 years of your life. So in year 2014, 99.7% of pediatrics positions in the country filled up. St. Patrick's Day comes and I get an email both from my dean and from the National Residency Matching Program at once saying like, "Dear Maureen Miller, we regret to inform you that you have not matched for the upcoming year." And my heart leapt beyond my throat in that moment. I thought I was going to die. I mean, I had had issues with depression before that, but I actually, there's an entire week where you have to like screw around with phone calls for what's known as the scramble to find another position, and every single scramble interviewer is like, "What are you doing in the scramble? You sound like a very good pediatrician to me." So that didn't work out, and so then the pathology department at NYU, where I had been for several years in like other capacities, somehow Dr. Malama and another guy, Michael Bannon, caught wind of my story, and that I didn't have a job, and they just by total fluke, random chance, had a position open because somebody failed a drug test. It was horrible. Like I hope that person got a job. Like, so I came in thinking that I didn't really want to be there, I guess. And so not only did I not want to be doing a specialty that I didn't want to do, like I did not want to live at all. I spent a good 18 months of my residency beginning in the specialty of surgical pathology, where you dissect the dead, and then the remainder of that in autopsy, where you autopsy the dead. And I was aware that Bellevue was a very auspicious place for this kind of anatomic pathology research, but when your job for 6 months is doing for 14 hours a day the actual literal act of dissecting life, it's really hard, especially when you're always assigned to the GYN service. And every time it's products of conception, uterus, hysterectomy, and everybody has the same set of benign tumors or fibroids. And then every time getting exposed to formaldehyde at one point, splashing an ovarian tumor on my head, thinking every single moment of the day, I wish I were dead. And then going home during the first month of this period, I kept seeing this guy, nicest guy in the world. I mean, he's one of those people who you don't begrudge that he's perfect. And then he seemed very happy about things. And then lo and behold, August 2014, when we both started internship year together, he has this plum internship uptown. And then he jumps off the roof of the building across the street from Bellevue Hospital. I was told while I was in a dissecting room, everybody in the hospital, every level of the medical center, completely devastated, many of us completely taken by surprise. And so I thought, if he had known that I was suicidal, would that have helped him out? And so Dr. Malama's solution to that, being the experienced pathologist, is oh, just read the autopsy books, obviously. Obviously. And with that kind of assurance, too. And so finally, I'm fine, I'll do it. So my last year of residency, Dr. Malama's in the hospital all the time. And so I found the one window where he's not there on Sunday morning, where I would complete the project in secret without him, so that I didn't want to let him know he had won, basically. and I would come into this book that was incredibly water damaged, had to have been about close to 20 pounds, completely hand transcribed by dictationists. And their autopsy reports, I have to say, were spectacular. They were half a page long. They were not the 6-page magnum opuses that we were producing during our fellowship. They just say left lung looks like right lung, diagnosis pneumonia, done. So from reading this, I thought we see mostly men, mostly white people, but really people from all areas and all walks of life in Bellevue coming to this one place where you could tell that the doctors are so bored by what they're doing writing this autopsy book that they want to die too. And so at Dr. Malama's request, I became interested in the lives of the pathologists who were writing this book in 1897. And they were, there are a lot of characters in there, people who pioneered medical photography of syphilis, people who fought on both sides of the Civil War conflict, and just people with fascinating stories. But then there was this one guy who kept having all the reports. He was the black cloud of the intern year, and kept getting all the autopsies, and he was the most meticulous about him too. So I looked him up. His name is Joseph Goldberger. He's actually from very close by here, apparently, like grew up in a Hungarian immigrant family on the Lower East Side, and was the valedictorian of his medical school class, did everything right, but decided after his de facto pathology residency at Bellevue that, like, clinical medicine was not for him and that he was going to go do public health in the field. So he didn't go do public health in the field just like backpacking through Europe in 1897 equivalent. What he decided to do was to go to prisons in Georgia and Mississippi and figure out why the people have a neurologic disorder, which then turned out to be pellagra. People thought it was an infection. He figured out that it was malnutrition. And so, like, this guy who I just completely landed on serendipitously turned out to have exactly the kind of public health practice that I hope to have in my own career someday, having gone through this very circuitous route of pathology. I guess that's a roundabout way of saying that, like, I feel like Dr. Melamed on some level knew before I did that I was a pathologist. I was this, like, eccentric historian of esoteric stuff that nobody wants to talk about for 10 minutes. So I am a pathologist. Things came over. If you ever see Dr. Melamed's name on your report, he's a terrific man.
Thank you so much, Maureen, for coming to talk to us about the story that you told at our event in New York City last October. You said, back when I was in medical school, I used to write stories and do little performances, but it wasn't as me, Maureen the doctor. It was as this character of Maureen the doctor. It wasn't the real me. And so I was wondering about that, this concept of I'm not going to be the real me, I'm going to be the character of me. What does that mean to you, and who do you think showed up that night? Is this Maureen, or is this the character of Maureen, and what's the difference?
I mean, I think that there's a difference in the voice modulation, I guess. I don't come from a performing background at all. I mean, I come from a very animated family, like basically what you would think of as almost like an early 1960s Irish stereotype. Like there was some NBC miniseries about like a Chicago family, the Hurleys. That's kind of our vibe, but just like a little bit crazy. So like that I would say is like maybe the baseline me. I had done a lot of writing in college. I didn't really want to necessarily be a professional screenwriter or anything like that, but I had read about like a lot of comedy writers who kind of grew up like me in very like boisterous Irish families with very significant histories of I mean, I'm going into like the depression, the alcoholism, whatever stereotype. I mean, I'm not a mimic, but if you want like the old sod thing, that's basically where I'm going. And so you would read about people like Conan O'Brien or the O'Donnell brothers, or this other guy who's a lesser-known Simpsons writer, George Meyer, who writes a lot about his experience as a pre-med at Harvard. And you would see from that these people who were like naturally inclined really not to be like writers but pre-meds, like used their experiences to talk really about like their depression and their dissatisfaction with like the collapse of the American social safety net. That I thought like I relate to the way those guys are putting their creative product out into the world. And so like a lot of my writing sounded like that. And then by the time I got to medical school, which is discussed a little bit in the story that I presented with you, I thought to myself like that sensibility does not jibe with what I'm doing here at all.
I noticed that a lot. I think that's a stereotype of comedians, is that like they're all depressed, or, comedy is really a way that we can get close to the darkness and make it so that it's not so scary anymore. So I'm wondering, specifically considering the way that you perform and the substance of what you're saying, do you feel like humor is a tool for you? What is the role of humor in your approach to your job and in your approach to your history of struggles with mental illness and mental health?
You can say mental illness, that's okay. Like, I mean, I think that's why it's important for people to do projects like your podcast. I think that I mean, for example, like when people say like I'm going to therapy, I always say like I'm going to see my psychiatrist. I think it's really critical that your colleagues know that it's okay to do things like that. But getting back to your question, I guess I think like there was a point at which like it really like before I had even gone the pre-medical route per se, like I had dabbled with it as a freshman in college, but then had like a kind of a burnout period from having gone to a science high school. And I think, because the Colbert Report, if I remember, came out when I was, want to say a senior in college, I think it was. And, like, when you read interviews about Colbert, Colbert would always say, like, well, like he was famous as the one comedian who isn't depressed. And like, when you go back and trace his life story, he was saying, like, I never wanted to play Hamlet, I wanted to be Hamlet. And I thought, like, I mean, it's a really, like, terrifically sad statement, but there was something very, like, Catholic about that. And I don't consider what I do, like, stand-up and all. I can see where other people might think that. But what I did notice, though, I wonder if this is more of a specifically New York experience of training. But, like, in my third year of medical school, I went to NYU, which, as, like, some listeners might know, is the furthest downtown of the medical schools. It's the closest to the media industry and the entertainment industry geographically. And then also has this affiliation with Bellevue, the public hospital that famously gets a lot of just like rich people and celebrities into. It's just a bizarre mix of people. And then like in response to seeing that, like on rounds, you would see these particular like very milquetoast people who suddenly become these like gesticulating characters. They're like throwing around things or tapping their papers. They're, like, doing weird things with their pencils, like, pretending to fall asleep and becoming this, like, very, like, melodramatic, like, reenactment of their patients almost. And I couldn't tell whether it was them processing their experiences at the bedside or not, because, like, there really wasn't a lot of effort to conceal that they were doing it from the patients. I don't think they were deliberately making fun of it. It was just the idiom in which they knew how to talk to one another.
What you're saying reminds me a little bit of my experiences being in New York. My parents used to take me to New York all the time to see Broadway shows. They were big theater fans. And so ever since I was a little kid, I would go to the Broadway show with my parents. And then after the show, we would wait at the stage door for all the actors to come out. And like all the makeup was off, all the wigs were off, their costumes were off, and they were wearing, you know, like jeans and a puffy jacket. And then years later, when I went into medicine, I just remember having this feeling where I would leave the hospital, you know, and part of that ritual is like taking off the white coat and putting on my, you know, Patagonia fleece and then disappearing back onto the sidewalk like a normal person. And there was this moment where I kind of felt like the actor. I kind of felt like, wow, here I am now walking on the sidewalk and people looking at me and nobody knows what I've seen. Nobody knows the strange thing that I was just doing 4 hours ago. I just look like a normal person. And so this idea of identity and performance and costume really resonates with me. And I'd like to pivot the conversation a little bit in the same vein of identity because, you know, you throughout your training had always thought of yourself as a pediatrician. You were really interested in pediatrics, public health, you were a school teacher, you were interested in chemical and occupational exposures, very specific career path. And then the match day comes and you don't match and you find yourself, you know, being recruited into this pathology residency where you never thought you'd be. And for me, being a doctor is a huge part of my identity, but being an internist specifically, my specialty is a big part of my identity. And so I was wondering, since we're talking about identity, did you have to go through a kind of shift from pediatric doctor to pathologist? And what did that shift look like specifically? Because I think pathologists have a lot of stereotypes around, you know, the kinds of people who they are. And your story touches on this a little bit. At the end, you say, you know, I actually am a pathologist. I didn't know it. Dr. Malaman knew before me, but I am a pathologist. And I just would love to hear you expand a bit on your identity as a pathologist and how that's evolved over time.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, the one thing that doesn't come across in the story is, like, I really liked histology. I was not so keen on anatomy just because that's, like, a whole nother story in itself. But I mean, like, I always thought histology was pretty and interesting. I didn't know anything about cell biology. Like, throughout my training, I remember being very insecure about not being a bench scientist. And this came from the fact that, like, I went to a science and tech high school where many of my classmates ultimately did pursue PhDs in the basic sciences. I think that actually is one reason why I ended up fitting in as a pathologist as well. Pathologists are kind of like psychiatrists in that, like, they're always asking you the next question. Like, even though they want to come to an ultimate diagnosis, they're like, why are you in today? Like, I'm cold. What's making you cold? And so, like, pathologists tend to ask almost like meandering questions. And Dr. Malamed, who is like the ultimate stereotype of like the pathologist sitting back in the lab looking at the microscope, he's more of a translational researcher, but like a very, very research-minded guy who then just like happens to have a clinical practice because he feels a very strong social impulse to do it. There's a very strong sense of vocation. This isn't true of all pathologists, but pediatricians on the whole seem like much sadder people. Like there's a guy, Chris Adrian, who's now at Columbia, who was at UCSF for a while, a pediatric oncologist who's a novelist, who I think like writes very well about that. Just like the pure like almost relentless sadness of doing even a very healthy child pediatric practice. I mean, like, the outpatient pediatricians like to see kids get better, which was more like what I envisioned myself doing, I suppose. But, like, the inpatient docs, it's like there's a priestly quality about it that I'm not sure I have myself. So in retrospect, I was like, well, maybe it's better that I ended up in this other field where there's a little bit of detachment.
I want to talk a little bit about one of the main aspects of being a pathologist, which is writing up the pathology report. And one of the parts of your story that I liked best was when you were comparing the autopsy reports of today to the autopsy reports of 1897, and how today they're pages and pages long, and, you know, there's all this detail, like the upper lung shows this sort of changes, and then in the middle there's this sort of changes, and then there's this nodule here, and it's infiltrating this basal membrane, and blah, blah, blah. But back then, in 1897, it just said left lung, full, diagnosis, pneumonia. And so I'm wondering, in your mind, which style is better? And is there something about the way that we're doing it these days that is reflective of our tendency to medicalize and overthink decay and death? Whereas back then it was more just simple. How do you think about the differences between the reports now and the reports then?
Coming into talking about the writing of pathology reports, I was much more aligned with what you just articulated really well there. But in terms of the writing style of the reports, I agreed that it was probably because of like having a higher volume of deaths that you were seeing on a regular basis. It was also, I did some research on the educational structures of how the interns would have been functioning at the time. And so, I mean, those are the internal medicine doctors like effectively doing autopsies on their own patients.
Wow.
Yeah.
So they would have to do autopsies on patients who they
exactly.
knew when the patient was alive. Whereas for you, it's a little bit more disconnected, which may help with the mental health of everyone involved.
Well, yeah. And then in reference to the, I mean, I guess that's a separate subject. My classmate who died by suicide, like, that was my first impression when he died. I went to my assistant program director, who was an autopsist, and I said, like, make sure that no pathology resident has to autopsy that man. Like, I just thought, like, I couldn't bear the idea of doing that. Yeah, but I don't think long reports are necessarily bad. For the most part, they're about medical legal protection. When it comes to, like, if somebody were to bring it up in a court of law and say, like, well, did you examine it in the standard of practice way, they'd be like, yeah, that's a problem. And, like, half of your job as a pathology resident on an anatomic service is to effectively proofread the work for your boss. And in Dr. Malamed's case, you take dictation from him that he'll, like, extemporize. So it's fascinating, but in his case, it's because he really wants to get to the right answer. He doesn't care about the medical legal aspect. I mean, he wants the report to be right, but he's just interested in being exact. And that's because he loves it a lot. He's very unusual in that way.
And there's something I want to ask you about these pathology reports, because you're such a vibrant storyteller. How does it feel to be writing these documents which may or may not ever be read or seen by anyone? It sounds like really they exist in the event that they get dredged up for some kind of criminal case, or malpractice case rather. But if no one sues anyone, they just go into the box. And that's what I think is so beautiful about your story, is that the box comes back out. It comes back out, 100 years later. And there you are reading the reports, and, almost like that wasn't supposed to happen. And the fact that it did happen, there's something really beautiful about that. And I think in an earlier version of your story, you said something like those patients were worth saving. And I love the dual meaning of the word saving there, because, saving as if putting away, but also saving almost as if you were saving their lives in a sense. So could you talk a little bit about that? What is it like to be writing, as an amazing writer, to be writing these reports that may just kind of vanish into the ether, never to be seen again? Does that weigh on you at all, or how does that feel?
I mean, first of all, thank you. That's very nice of you to say about the work, but it may actually tie in, I guess, that, I write all the time. I would probably say I write upwards of 2 hours a day. I write at work. And this is just, creative writing on top of my day job, but 99.9% of it does not get published, and I think there's an unfortunate perception among a lot of doctors who are beginning to do this narrative medicine work that in order for the story to be heard, it must be published. I urge people to let that go. And it's not because it's not good. It's not because it's not interesting. But it's because maybe the purpose of a story is to be let out for the group of people that you're talking with, that your audience doesn't have to be the world, and the story still is beautiful. I mean, it's nice that we found these books. But this, I guess, goes back to the ethnic thing, too. And actually, Conan O'Brien made a joke recently, and it wasn't really a joke, but, he gave an interview to the New York Times Arts section where he said, we're all going to be, after our graves, we're all going to be forgotten.
I read this. I remember this. I loved it.
I know. I was so impressed. So anyway, this interview was with Conan O'Brien. He was launching a new iteration of his show on TBS. That they were trying to make it appeal to a younger audience and with shorter material, more internet content. And he is, I think he's in his mid-50s, if I remember correctly. He was talking about how changing the show to a younger format was causing him to have a lot of reflections on his life and think about the things that he had not accomplished with the show, even though he had gotten on television at a very precocious age. And so he started saying, I really like the historian Robert Caro, who researched Lyndon B. Johnson for 50 years of his life, and I still can't get the guy on my show. And it just reminds me that life is a very unpredictable, fleeting thing. And he's saying that, you have to realize that, shows are going to change, life is going to change.
I just wanted to ask, because I know you're working in transfusion medicine, and there's a lot of, I imagine, public health work to be done in the realm of transfusion medicine. So what does your career path look like now? Have you been able to realize your dream of doing work in public health? What is it like now for you to be working in transfusion medicine, which is very different than doing autopsies, obviously, working with live specimens instead of dead ones, for instance? I'd just love to hear you reflect a bit on the way that your career has gone and your thoughts around it.
I mean, going into transfusion medicine from what I was doing with the dissections before was certainly an enormous shift that actually it was just you're seeing different kinds of patients. They're from towns that you've never heard of before. And I mean, people would laugh because I don't, Lagrange, I don't know how to pronounce anything. The patient population's totally different. And then you have some recapitulations Grady Hospital, which is the Bellevue of Atlanta. You think how did America allow people to become this poor, which would fix so many of the problems? And I mean, it's to the point where I would come in tears, scream in my car.
But it sounds like despite that part of it, that it was really gratifying to you.
Oh yeah, no, I love it. And I mean, in transfusion, like, people improve. Like, you give them a blood and then they're not anemic anymore. That's really cool. And you get to interact with families, like even the families where the patient dies. You develop long-term relationships that you might not expect were part of the specialty. In terms of like the public health problems in the specialty, like, they're phenomenal. I mean, like, transfusion-transmitted infection does not end with, like, HIV in the 80s. The blood supply it's very safe, but what I'm interested in potentially is looking at, like, how diseases in the blood supply or, like, characteristics of the blood supply are going to be affected by climate change and disaster response and stuff like that. So that I'm going to be working for the CDC next year. I hope to that's what I hope to be more the arc of my career.
That's so wonderful. I didn't know that, and I'm just smiling so big right now to hear that news and to know that you are living out your dream of having a career in public health, and that despite your twisted path.
Twisted is good. Like, pathology is a very twisted specialty.
Well, I meant twisted more in the literal sense, like winding, but I guess twisted sure could also apply in a more metaphorical sense.
But I guess, like, even though I talked about, like, transfusion as being more for me, there's a fit in pathology for everybody. Pathology is the perfect specialty for creatives, too. Like, nobody ever hears the stories of pathologists in narrative medicine. Like, I write op-eds and stuff all the time, can't get them published. I feel like just, like, people have not yet internalized that, like, our issues are interesting to, like, lay people. Because, I mean, we're working on you guys.
Well, I couldn't be more thrilled to have the voice of a pathologist, and specifically your voice, on the stage at the Nocturnist, and then also on our show, on our podcast, because you do have such an incredible story that I hope that people listen and hear it and see the specialty of pathology in a different way and embrace it with all the light and all the dark. So thank you so much, Maureen, and you probably got to get back to your hemolyzing patients and save their lives. That was the inimitable Maureen Miller. For the sake of keeping this podcast alive, I want to put in a special plug for our Patreon website. For people who aren't able to give large amounts of money, it's actually really helpful if you just throw us $1 or $3 or even $5 a month. You can find us on Patreon, Patreon. I also want to give a shout out to our friends at the House of Pod. It's a really awesome medical talk show. Check it out for some great conversations and some laughs. I also want to put in a plug for a very special medical conference called .MD. It's a festival of medical curiosity, and it takes place every year in Galway, Ireland. And this year, it's from Friday, September 13th to Saturday, September 14th. Check it out online, and if you're feeling like a trip to Europe, this may be just what the doctor ordered. Special thanks to executive producer Ali Block, podcast producer Marina Poole, program coordinator and head of story development Adelaide Papazolo, sound engineer Alberto Hernandez, assistant producer Kirk Lockie, our podcast intern Chloe Lassard, social media manager B. Logan, our illustrator Lindsay Mound, our composer Yessie Monroe, and the voice of Boaz Monroe, and our fundraising lead Cecilia Peterson. This episode's story was coached by me, Emily Silverman. And last but not least, thanks to our storyteller, Maureen Miller. We are the Nocturnists. See you next week.